Today we're going to be talking about how to take care of the Lady Slipper Orchids, or the Paphiopedilum. This is a great orchid if you are starting to get into them and you're wanting to get something a little bit different than your regular Phalaenopsis, something that you're going to find at the grocery store. They're terribly easy to care for, especially if you like to water. That is one note that I'll say that's going to be different, and I'll talk about it more as we get into the care video, but these are a much more frequent watering plant than probably your Phalaenopsis is. But with that, let's get into the care guide for these beautiful little orchids. First of all, I want to point out the difference of the leaves right here. What you'll notice right here is the mottled leaves. That's the different colors of green that we have here. This care guide is going to apply both for the mottled leaf version and the regular green leaf version. There's really no difference in their care. It's just a different little look. So this will apply to your orchid if you don't have the mottled leaves. First up, let's start with light. Now, this is advertised as a low light orchid. However, these don't do well in a true low light in terms of foot candles. Low light in terms of foot candles, so how it's scientifically measured, is between 50 and 100 foot candles. These are going to bloom in closer to bright light, so you really want to get them up into the higher hundreds or the 1,000 foot candles. So I would like to put these in at least 500 to 1,000 foot candles for 4 hours a day. Now, if you don't have a light meter, the best way to do that is to get down on your plant's perspective and look out at the sky. You want to make sure that you have a wide view of the sky. You should be able to turn your head to the left and to the right and see nothing but unobstructed blue sky. If you're going to put this in a south-facing window or a west-facing window, those windows are typically a little bit more hot than our north and our east-facing windows. So if you can feel physical heat coming off, like radiating off of those off of the glass like that, I want you to step these orchids back a couple of feet. You still want to maintain that wide view of the sky, but these leaves are susceptible to burn, so we don't want it to get too hot, especially during the spring and summer months when our days are really long and hotter. If you go through an entire year and your Lady Slipper orchid has not flowered, it's likely that the plant is not in bright enough light. That's definitely the #1 reason why these plants won't flower. Next up, let's talk about watering. I mentioned earlier in the video that these are going to be a little bit different than your regular Phalaenopsis orchids. Now, Phalaenopsis orchids, they grow on the sides of trees, so their roots are always exposed to air. So we let all of their soil dry out in between watering. These are terrestrial orchids, so they actually grow in the ground. They're used to much more frequent watering. So what we want to do is walk by and touch the topsoil, and every time that topsoil has dried out, I want you to give it a good thorough saturation. These are bog orchids, okay, so they want to be consistently moist. Now, still let that topsoil dry out in between watering. It shouldn't be constantly wet, but that's going to be the main difference between the Phalaenopsis orchid, which is most commonly grown, and these orchids here. As far as repotting goes, I like to do that every 1 to 2 years, or when the roots start coming out of the bottom drainage holes, whichever one comes first. And there are a couple different ways to go about it. Now, these have a much thinner root system than your typical orchids, the moth orchids, the grocery store orchids. So we want to use a little bit finer of a mixture. Long fiber sphagnum moss is perfectly fine, mixed in with some fir bark, or you can just use a regular orchid bark. Now, if you're going to use bark, just straight bark, I recommend getting the finer bark. It comes in different sizes, and get one that is smaller in diameter. Again, because these orchids like to stay damp, this is going to ensure the orchids don't dry out too quickly, and it's going to keep you from having to water every day. Now, I recommend repotting when they are not in flower, so wait till the flowers die off and then do your repotting. And of course, we're going to adhere to that general rule that we always talk about whenever we are repotting. We just go up 1 to 2 pot sizes at the very most. Oftentimes with orchids, we don't go up in pot size at all, but it really depends on the diameter of the root ball. So if you have a 3-inch root ball diameter, you would go up to a 4-inch or a 5-inch diameter pot at most. As far as fertilizing goes, do that while the flowers are not on. So as soon as you see the flower spike coming up, stop fertilizing, but all throughout the rest of the year, you can fertilize these plants, no problem. As long as you're seeing new growth coming on with your foliage here, it's perfectly fine to fertilize your plant, and I just use a general purpose orchid fertilizer for that. But that's gonna do it for the care instructions for the Paphiopedilum orchid. If you have any questions about this beauty, please leave them in the comments below.